Regular listeners of the program will know we have been covering the big pharma crisis in this country, a crisis of pricing, and crisis rather of pricing, and therefore of availability and what can be done about it in this country. Our next guest is an expert in that field, an expert in intellectual property law. Professor Mickey Davis is a professor at the Cleveland Marshall College of Law, very familiar with intellectual property and patent law and the pharmaceutical industry, and he joins us now. First of all, Professor, thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, it's really my pleasure.
The I guess the lead-in topic to this whole general area, at least in my thinking, is your response in Health Affairs blog to a piece that was written there about the pharmaceutical industry, its manipulation of patent laws, and our ability, which I think you're saying we already have as a government, to do something about drug pricing. And I'm speaking specifically of the Bayh-Dole Act. That's B-A-Y-H, Senator Bayh-Dole Act. What does the Bayh-Dole Act allow us to do to rein in high drug prices in this country?
The Bayh-Dole Act is really quite clear that any, almost any drug invention developed with federal monies is subject to what they call federal marching. That is, the invention can be ordered to be licensed to someone else if the original contractor hasn't made it available to the public on reasonable terms, which can only be read as reasonable prices because the public doesn't really deal with inventions except by buying them. So the only terms the public has is the prices, and the statute says they have to be kept reasonable. It's a little more complicated than that, and I think this is why Mr. Engelberg in his Health Affairs piece was a little confused. And this is a little technical. I don't want to. You should turn on a siren or something if it gets too boring.
I'll step in. I'll step. Trust me, I'll step in. But please go ahead.
Patent lawyers are used to what they call working requirements in other countries. Other countries, over 100 of them, in fact, we're one of the few countries who never had a working requirement. If somebody got a patent and they didn't work it, that is, they didn't make it available, they didn't use it, or they didn't sell it, or in some cases, which were even more strict in some countries, if they didn't have people in that country actually making it, it was held to be not worked, and therefore it would be subject to a compulsory license.
So
and that was triggered because the drug wasn't available.
And let me just step in for a second and say, if the government grants me a patent for an automobile engine that runs on water, which everybody would want, and I take the patent but I never manufacture it, the legal principle here would be, well, we're not giving you the right to sit on something and not use it or not make it widely available, because that's the point of giving you the patent in the first place, right?
You're not working it, but that's only in other countries. We have no working requirement.
Okay. But I guess I'm making the point that there's a valid reason why other countries have this, a logical reason for it.
Absolutely. So what we did is we wrote a very different statute, the Bayh-Dole statute, and unfortunately we use the same language that the other countries use for mere availability. And so we say that marching can be started by the government when an invention that's funded by the government, and only those funded by the government, is not available. So it sounds to most patent lawyers like, well, I know that, as long as they're making it. And about 5 federal courts and the FDA on 5 different occasions have turned on marching rights because they say it's available. What they don't do is they don't look at the statute, because the statute defines what they mean by making it available and having practical application. And I'll give you the words. It says practical application means that the invention is being utilized and that its benefits are, to the extent permitted by law, available to the public on reasonable terms. So we don't mean available, we mean available on reasonable terms. No other country uses that. The Bayh-Dole statute is very special. It applies only to government inventions, that is, inventions that you and I pay for with our taxes. And it makes sense. The Congress thought, if we pay for this and we're going to give it to a private guy, he at least has to make it available at a reasonable price. You can't make us overpay twice.
Right.
And so margin rights have been there since 1980. And Republican and Democratic administrations alike have done nothing. So here's the pessimistic part. I don't care what law we pass. If we have administrations that are subservient to the pharmaceutical companies and afraid to upset them, no matter what law we have, we won't use it.
Right.
Because this law could have been used at any time in 35 years with the president, whoever it was, just sending a note to the FDA. Please enforce these margin rights.
So here's the good news to me in what you're saying, and we're talking to Professor Mickey Davis of I am sorry, I'm blanking on this, Cleveland Marshall School of Law, excuse me. Here's the good news for me, potentially, I should say. When we talk about new legislation to rein in drug prices, we have to talk about political realities that make that a stretch goal. And granted, you're saying that administrations of both parties have failed to use the law we've got. But if we've got a law on the books, then it is possible for an administration to enforce that law. So that, for example, and this may seem like belaboring the obvious, Professor Davis, but for example, if a medication, a life-saving medication, is only available at the cost of $1,000 a pill and is based on publicly funded research, that is not reasonable terms, because $1,000 for a pill that may cost $10 to manufacture is not a reasonable price, right? And this is something that an administration could do if the people demanded that they do it. Am I stating that correctly?
Yes, as long as the second part of your argument is right. If it costs them $10 to make it, then $1,000 seems like we're being scalped. So it would depend on a little bit of investigation. And the funny thing is, the agency says, well, they're not able to. The FDA just says, they throw up their hands and say, we can't judge this. This is not what we do. But they're supposed to do it. The statute says they should do it. But since they haven't gotten ready and they haven't hired the economists and they haven't hired anybody else, they turn around and say, we can't set prices. It's not our job. But in fact, the Bayh-Dole Act says it is their job.
Now, what is the applicable agency? Is it the FDA?
No, it's whatever agency funds the contractor. It's very often the FDA. It's often the NIH. It's probably more often the NIH than anybody else.
So,
and they fund billions of dollars of research.
So let me ask you then, just as a matter of principle, let's take the EpiPen, because it's in the news now. Or maybe maybe I have my facts right, but if some portion of a device, let's say the EpiPen is a delivery system for epinephrine, which has been around for a while, if either or any element of something like the EpiPen was developed through publicly funded research, does this law then apply to the entire product?
No, it would just depend on the federally funded parts. But the EpiPen has been around way longer than any patent term. So anybody could manufacture the original EpiPen if they wanted to, as long as they don't use any newly patented details. And, pharmaceutical companies are always adding on little details that usually aren't essential. So any competitor who wanted to make an EpiPen, since it's not patented, could easily make it and compete.
Then why don't they?
This doesn't involve the Bayh-Dole Act.
Just parenthetically, why don't they?
I think I know why. The pharmaceutical company or sector is sort of like a combination of terrorists and welfare recipients.
I wouldn't disparage welfare recipients if I were you, but go ahead.
Yeah, they're like welfare cheats.
Okay.
They have gotten used to getting a lot of free money, and getting all this free money and government patents. They make twice as much for their sector as any other sector in the country. So they're kind of spoiled. Their stockholders are used to getting 20+% return on what they invest.
Gotcha.
So if one of those companies invested at their stock would go down. So they can't afford to invest in anything that would be normal exploitation,
right?
Because they're spoiled.
So a 20% rate of return or whatever is just beneath them. Yeah,
and because their stockholders would scream.
Right.
And this is a terrible situation to be in. And there's a very well-known progressive economist named Dean Baker.
Oh, we've had him on the show many.
articles.
Yeah, we've had Dean on the show many times. Yeah.
Yeah, Dean has been on many times. Dean wrote a great article about, and he's written the details of it since. But about 15 years ago, he said we could be so much better off if we did. First of all, we do our research because we pay for it ourselves, and then if we developed the drugs and sold them ourselves, we would save so much money if the pharmaceutical industry was basically nationalized.
Right.
Same as water is, and police is, and the army is, and everything else that we really need.
Right. So you could make the argument it's a public good, I suppose. So, Professor Davis, what are some examples? Since the Bayh-Dole Act gives us the right to do this Marching process for pharmaceuticals that were funded with publicly funded research, what are some examples? Can you think of any examples off the top of your head of pricing?
The last time I was able to do it was about 10, 15 years ago when I was really heavily involved in the specific drugs, and all the AZT and AZT derivatives and the anti-AIDS drugs were in that category because they had all been funded by federal funding. But the companies very deftly avoided getting caught in that. The Act requires that if somebody has federal funding and comes up with an invention and they patent it, they have to put on the patent, this drug is subject to the Bayh-Dole Act. And when I originally brought this up, which was more than 20 years ago, when they had a congressional hearing, they discovered that 90% of the drugs had no such legend. So the pharmaceutical industry is not embarrassed by avoiding the law. So we really don't know until we look at each one and each funding which drugs are Bayh-Dole drugs and which ones are not. But we do know from, for instance, the knowledge, ecology, KEI, whatever that group is, that 90% of new drugs that really do something besides grow hair on your head are developed with federal funds. So almost any important drug is probably the product of federal funding.
So this is an enormously powerful tool. First of all, I can't help asking: are there penalties for failing to disclose that a drug was? Since they're not doing it, are there penalties for failing to disclose that a drug is the product of the Bayh-Dole Act?
Well, there's no specific penalty. You'd have to look through the criminal code and find other sections relating to fraud. I know that Henry Waxman had me testify about 2 decades ago about this, and I said, well, they're not doing anything they're supposed to do. And he looked at me and said, well, what should we do? And I said, I think it's time to call in the cops. And at that, he swung down his gavel and said, this meeting is adjourned. So I don't think anybody really wants to punish the drug company.
Right.
I think they all get too much.
No, I know. It was more a matter of curiosity than anything else. But if most of our drugs are funded this way, subject to the Bayh-Dole Act, it seems to me we have identified an extremely powerful tool and should be holding our presidential candidates and our next president accountable for using it. To use it, or accountable for not using it, as the case may be. Would you agree?
Yeah, I spent half of my life on this, and nothing's happened. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with the rest of my term. It's just scandalous. I mean, you know, and I know, everybody knows that the pharmaceutical drug companies pay all the candidates millions of dollars. They play it safe, and these candidates, whoever it is, whatever their initials are, I don't think are about to upset the apple cart. It's going to take some kind of Occupy Pharma or something like that before anything is done.
Well, count on me to be part of that movement. In fact, maybe, we're going to try to start that movement. There are a lot of us who feel strongly, and Occupy Pharma is not a bad name. So thank you for that.
I think we should do it. I'll be there next to you.
All right. You can count on it. Okay, Professor Mickey Davis of the Cleveland Marshall College of Law. Thanks for all your great research and your depth of knowledge on this topic, and thanks for coming on the program.
I love your show. Thank you for having me.